So, Migrant Roots Media is an independent media organization that centers the voices of migrants, children of migrants, and people resisting migration in their countries of origin. So, we do this strategically in order to highlight the root causes of forced displacement from the voices of people who have been directly affected. So, our work challenges mainstream narratives about migration, including liberal narratives that the United States is a, quote, nation of immigrants, when we know that it is a settler colonial state founded on indigenous genocide and the forced enslavement of African people. So, another common liberal narrative, for example, that we examine through our work is the idea that immigrants contribute, that immigrants are deserving because they contribute to the economy, rather than because many of them have been forcibly displaced from their own countries of origin due to the effects of US foreign policy in those countries, and that they, as migrants here in the US, therefore should have the right to the freedom of movement, to safety, food, and housing, among other basic necessities for survival. So when we as Migrant Roots Media talk about the root causes of migration, we consider these root causes to be global systems like global capitalism and imperialism, which are essentially maintained and advanced through tools like US foreign policy. So these systems, we believe, create the conditions of poverty, instability, precarity, exploitation, and violence that push people in the first place to leave their countries of origin. So through our work and in our platform, we encourage our writers to think through these larger structures and to think about how they have affected their own lives personally, how these structures have affected their own life stories. And then in that way, we use personal narrative as a tool to also build political consciousness. Yeah, so we published the policy report on January 13th of this year, which was just a few days before the inauguration of the Biden-Harris administration. And we as an organization wanted to write this report directly from the perspective of, of us being migrants and children of migrants, because we knew that a win for the Democrats here in the United States would mean that a lot of people, unfortunately, would go to sleep for the next 4 years. So what I mean by that? So what I mean is that when Trump was in office, his blatant racism and xenophobia agitated many people. However, we at Migrant Roots Media believe that U.S. foreign policy advances a bipartisan agenda of U.S. capitalist hegemony worldwide. So essentially, we wrote this report because we didn't want people to fall into the trap of thinking that because the Democrats are in power and because the face of empire is different, right? Like it's diverse or it's nicer, that means that we should stop organizing for better conditions, and also calling out, how forced migration is connected to a long history of U.S. imperialism in Central America, and through policies that have been implemented through both organizations, through both parties, Republican and Democrat. So another kind of reason why we wrote this report is because we think that the Democrats do a great job at co-opting the language of social justice movements. For example, in the Biden-Harris administration plan for Central America, they talk directly about addressing the root causes of migration from Central America, which, like I was explaining in the first question, that language is almost directly the same as almost identical to the way our platform uses that language of root causes. However, we as an organization felt called to challenge the narrative that the Biden-Harris administration is putting forward, because what they claim to be the root causes, are violence, poverty, corruption, whereas we actually think that those are the symptoms of neoliberal economic policies that have been implemented in the region. So we wrote the report because we really wanted to highlight what you're proposing as the root cause, what you're proposing as the solution, which is the further implementation of these neoliberal economic policies, is actually the root cause of what is causing the poverty, what is causing the violence, what is causing the precarity, what is causing the corruption. So essentially, in our report, we just provide a point-by-point analysis of the plan. So we go through, every single point that they proposed, and we basically just give our own counter argument related to show this argument of the neoliberal economic policies themselves being the root cause of migration. I'll add just a little bit more detail to that. So I pulled up one specific example from the plan, and again, you're right. Like Biden in his plan, he proposes to, and I'm quoting, renew the U.S. commitment to tackling the root causes driving migration with an integrated $4 billion regional strategy, and unquote. So that's quoted from the Biden plan. So basically, the way that we understand it is that a key component of neoliberal economic policy is the funneling of public funds into the private sector through the privatization of public institutions, right? So what we call public-private partnerships. And so when we were, analyzing the plan and looking at the language that the Biden-Harris administration is proposing, we know that a lot of this language is actually coded language for advancing efforts that benefit US-based multinational corporations. So for example, one of the points that Biden proposes as part of the $4 billion strategy is marshaling private sector investment, including through public-private partnerships to supplement government funds. So that's, almost directly the definition of neoliberal economic policies. And then also, looking at history, historically, the U.S. government, like I mentioned, has facilitated the presence of extractive corporations in Central America. So one of the well-known examples of this is Chiquita Brands International, which is one of the countless examples, like I said, of corporations that have seized lands and that have exploited workers and continue to do it. And then other agreements like CAFTA, which was signed by George W. Bush in 2005, it failed to deliver a lot of the economic growth that it promised initially, and instead it resulted in monopolizing access to affordable medicine, decreasing worker protections, and becoming another huge factor driving forced displacement from Central America. So just to kind of summarize those different points, ultimately we, as Migrant Roots Media, see these efforts are as part of a broader bipartisan agenda to establish free markets, which really means open to foreign investment and corporate extraction of public resources. And then that, the implementation of these policies and, prioritization of the interests of these corporations results in increased inequality. And then, especially for impoverished, racialized communities, particularly, indigenous communities and Afro-Indigenous communities in Central America. Both administrations have key differences in their approach, but we believe that they ultimately share the same goal of maintaining U.S. capitalist hegemony in the global South, including Central America. So, like I mentioned, I was talking about some of the plans and policies that have been implemented before, or some of the different agreements. And another agreement that we can, look back and pull from is the Alliance for Prosperity, which, was proposed by Biden, and it was implemented in 2014. So it was likewise proposed under the guise of promoting development as a humanitarian-based approach to Central American migration. But as according to the Center for Economic Policy and Research, it actually resulted in increasingly militarizing the society, and increasingly militarizing police and military forces who were involved in, countless human rights abuses, like the murder of the feminist indigenous activist Berta Cáceres in Honduras. So even though ultimately their approaches might be a little bit different, the ultimate, goal or agenda in the global South, we understand it to be the same. in early June of this year, like you mentioned, Kamala Harris visited Guatemala and then also Mexico. And when she was in her visit, specifically in Guatemala, she urged the migrants, or she urged people considering migrating to the United States to not come. So she said, do not come, do not come. You know, if you come, you will be turned back, essentially.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur. But we, as one of our priorities, will discourage illegal migration. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
So through Migrant Roots, we published a communique in solidarity with the people of Honduras, who are also people, you know, that are facing forced migration from Central America and who exist at the heart of what is being framed as like a migration crisis. And basically in that communique, which we also published through Migrant Roots, and which I can share the link with you, we wrote about how her statement is just further emblematic of the continuation of harmful bipartisan policies and immigration policies towards Central America. So in a way, it's like a continuation of the same. And it's also, you know, using this historical amnesia to really obscure the fact of what are the root causes, right? Like instead of, you know, calling out the neoliberal economic, I mean, obviously, like they wouldn't, but the way that we see it is just like she's kind of using that as a tool to obscure the true reasons of that are driving people out of those countries. And then also something that we talk about in the communique that we publish is that Harris brought executives from corporations like Nestle and Microsoft to Guatemala. And then she met with some of Guatemala's elites. And you know, if she really cared about hearing the voices of people directly affected by immigration policy, you know, she would have met with families of deportees or deportees themselves, you know, folks who have been deported to Guatemala, or families or the families of people who have died in detention centers or even crossing the border, right? So again, like, you know, for me, like the interests were pretty clear and like the clear kind of obscuring of the root causes of migration is intentional. You know, the interests are clear in like meeting with these corporations and not meeting with the people who are directly affected. So I guess the last thing that I would add to that is when Harris tells Central American migrants to not come to the United States, she's essentially encouraging them to stay in a place where their labor and livelihoods will be exploited by both U.S. and domestic capital. And for those already living here in the United States as undocumented migrants, it similarly makes their lives more precarious and exploitable. So the way that I would describe it is sort of, you know, based on like readings and some theory that I've read, is this idea that in a lot of ways, like Central America, you know, has been the backyard of the U.S. or like U.S. harmful U.S. foreign policy. Central American, along with the Caribbean, have been the primary targets of U.S. military occupation and direct influence. So, for example, broadly speaking, the U.S. government under both administrations has been trying to maintain their hegemony in the region since the 1820s with the Monroe Doctrine. Yeah, so I see that, and then, you know, so that's kind of like the first phase, you know, of U.S. imperialism in Central America, you know, with the Monroe Doctrine declaring Central and South America part of the U.S. sphere of influence. And then since the 1980s, when Latin America was undergoing a geopolitical movement to, you know, distance itself from that U.S. influence and build its own structures. And then the U.S. was undergoing its own like neoliberal term with Reaganism and then Clinton's third wave politics. Like we think that the U.S. has increased its covert and overt efforts to control Central American countries with a more globalized order of, you know, with the U.S. being at the top. So globalized order of, you know, global capitalism, like I have kind of talked about in some of the previous answers. Yeah, I think this is a really big question. So I would say that some of the main problems in Central America today include femicides and gender-based violence, gang violence, corruption, poverty, forced displacement, and also, recently environmental disasters like the hurricanes Eta and Iota. However, I think it's really important to remember that a lot of these social ills and a lot of these consequences are a direct result of, this international order that funnels wealth from the global south to the global north, right? So this system of global capitalism. And I think this system makes it almost impossible to escape the cycles of poverty, violence, environmental disaster, and forced migration that people are undergoing. And it's like, as long as this global order of the US maintaining hegemony in Central America remains, like these social ills are going to be created and exacerbated and worsened. So I think those are some of the main problems facing Central America, and then what is creating them. Like I said, is this sort of globalized order. So we had some recommendations for the kind of public of the international community. So our first recommendation is to uplift the voices and support the actions of people struggling on the ground and people who are organizing to stay in their homelands, because we believe in the right to both migrate, so the right to freedom of movement, as well as the right to not migrate. Like, we think that, people should be able to stay in their home countries if, that's what they want, that's where they want to live, and that's where they want to like build their lives and build their families. So definitely uplifting the voices of those who are organizing on the ground. And also for specifically the case of Central America, we also think that it's really important, particularly to support indigenous communities and movements. So I have some examples of like specific organizations that people can support or sort of like watch out for, and also like look at the media and like the communiques that they produce to hear the stories from those people who are directly affected, who are organizing in their own home countries. So in Honduras, there's COPIN and Ofrané, and I can also share the links to these with you. And then in El Salvador, there's El Centro Cultural Techantit, which is an indigenous-led like organization. And then in Guatemala, there's Hijos. And then finally, I would say, related to this idea of exacerbated environmental disasters, related to this idea of environmental disasters that are exacerbated by the presence of these multinational corporations in Central America. Recently the hurricanes, like I mentioned, Eta and Iota, hit Central America really hard. So another recommendation that we wrote at the time of the report, and which still holds true, is to support the victims of these hurricanes. And I know that in Honduras, for example, people can donate to Radio Progreso, which is one of their like news outlets. And those are, I think, the recommendations that I would propose.